Okay, welcome back everyone to the second lesson of this week. Again, this is going to be a relatively short lesson by me because we have a fairly long documentary to get through after this lesson. So instead of the typical reading, we're having a required viewing, so a documentary that looks into some of the most serious human rights abuses perpetrated by the US in the War on Terror, particularly in the context of Guantanamo Bay. And I'll end this lesson talking just very briefly about the War on Terror in the context of human rights. So, in this lesson, I want to turn more to I guess broadly to give us a framework of human rights in IR and how the development of the human rights discourse began, and I guess some of the key issues and examples of continuing human rights violations today. And to end with the question of who has rights in world politics today. So it's just going to be a very quick lesson. I apologize, I think my internet is again a bit slow, so there might be a lag between my voice and the screen, so apologies for that. Next slide. Okay, so I think when we're talking about human rights in the context of international relations, and even international law, we're really talking about a phenomenon and a subsequent discourse that began only after apologies, the end of the Second World War. Now, this was a very significant period, so post-1945, in that it led to the rise of the United Nations. The precursor of the UN, the League of Nations, had been proved to be ineffective. So the UN was, I guess, the League of Nations 2.0, and it really represented a new international, I guess, consensus to move towards some form of world government and a mechanism to stop wars on such scales happening ever again. So during this time, as the world was trying to recover from the horrors of the Second World War, there was a movement to talk about certain things which would prevent aggression and violence on that scale again. And one of the key concepts that emerged at the time was this thing called human rights. Now, up until that point, human rights, I guess, didn't really have widespread political backing and wasn't discussed thoroughly in any political document. But that changed with the creation of the UN Charter in 1945, and then more explicitly with the Declaration of Human Rights, which was more or less brought into force in 1948. It's a document that at the time was pretty widely backed. Given the political context, people didn't really want to be seen to be opposed to this idea of human rights. So at the General Assembly at the UN, when this document was brought forward, 48 of the nations at the time said that, yes, we wholeheartedly agree with the spirit and with what's been laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There were, however, 8 abstentions. So 48 against. No one was explicitly against the document, but there were 8 abstentions. And they were South Africa, who at the time was still engaged in apartheid and apartheid politics, so the division between whites and blacks. And the UDHR would have basically gone against what they were doing. The Soviet Union and a number of Soviet bloc countries also basically had an abstention because they were, I guess, the key argument at the time was that this document, the UDHR, was a fundamentally Western, i.e. American-driven document. And you can see the woman holding up the draft of the UDHR is Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of former President Franklin Roosevelt. And she was in charge of the drafting of that document. So they disagreed with the document on that front, but they also, I guess, held reservations because it was the start of the Cold War. So one war ended, another war began. And they knew that in the context of that war, what they were required to do perhaps went against the spirit of what was laid out in that document. And I think there's a great honesty in perhaps acknowledging that, because they were no different to the Soviet Union was no different to the West in this regard. The West was going to do exactly the same, but yet here was the West, America, saying that we're now going to be upholding human rights, so we're not going to be doing this and doing that. But in actual fact, that wasn't, always the case. So I think the Soviet position actually had some honesty and credibility to it, saying that, well, we're not actually going to be upholding some of the things that's laid out in the UDHR, so we're actually, we're not going to be part of this. So the question of why did human rights become, I guess, especially prominent after the Second World War, had a lot to do with what happened during the war, and particularly with the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis, primarily in Germany. And it was something that shocked the world, and whoever, regardless of whoever you were, it was a situation that many people just couldn't fathom, how almost an entire race of people were exterminated within a few short years. And things like that have happened since under Pol Pot's Cambodia, for example. So it was, I guess, coming to terms with the fact that, how do we stop something as simple but also as horrific as this from ever happening again? We don't have the legal, we don't have the political language and discourse needed to basically condemn these acts out of hand. We know that they're wrong, but why are they wrong? And how do we stop them from happening ever again, regardless of the situation, regardless of the time and the place? And this is where I think modern day human rights emerged. So the Second World War is a significant event, in part because it gave the world the push it needed to create the human rights legal and political framework that we have in place today. So at the end of the 1940s, we have the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But from a legal perspective, a declaration isn't binding in law, so it's an aspirational document. And it took some years later, roughly into the 60s, before the world again moved to, I guess, enforce or try to enforce what was laid out in the UDHR with greater specificity. And these are the two key documents at the bottom of the slide that I'm referring to. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, so dealing with the first generation of human rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, dealing with the second generation of human rights. So these documents were set out more explicitly as legal documents, and once a state agreed and decided to ratify these documents, it became binding law domestically. So it had, I guess, a bit more force than the UDHR did, which was a very broad, sweeping, and sometimes ill-defined document that was just aspirational at the time. But human rights, again, I think, had another renaissance as the Cold War ended. So the Cold War gave rise to what became known as the New World Order, where we started talking more about global democracy and global justice. And also, in the age of globalization, greater cooperation and communication between different countries and peoples. So the human rights discourse really flourished in this environment. There was no world war or on such great scale anymore. And in this environment, I think, the age that most of us have grown up in, this is the time when human rights began to flourish. But that, of course, is not without its problems, that we'll turn to momentarily. Next slide. So I think there are many examples of human rights violations that continue to exist in the world today, just because we have a human rights framework, both legally and politically. And it doesn't mean that violations aren't happening. They're happening everywhere, happening in Australia as we speak. So, they can be from very prominent things, such as I'll talk about the war on terror and slavery, to everyday things like violence against women, economic inequality. These are all human rights violations that continue to exist in the world today. But from the perspective of, I guess, international relations, I just wanted to flag two important ones, which I think many of you will probably already know, but might be of interest to you given your area of study, and that's the war on terror and slavery. So in the context of the war on terror, a coalition of the willing responded to initially the attacks on September 11 in the United States. But one of the, I guess, the most problematic aspects of that war was the creation of a detention camp, call it that, at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And the documentary We'll Watch refers to this issue much more explicitly. So using what became known as extraordinary rendition, the United States basically, without the permission of the courts, took suspected terrorists to countries where human rights of this or that nature had no effect, so the states hadn't ratified this or that document. And the military base in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba was one such country which was exempt from many of the human rights conventions and norms that, for example, the United States technically upheld. So through rendition, a number of suspected terrorists were moved to Guantanamo Bay and held there without charge for a number of years. Many are actually still there in one form or another, and they were interrogated and tortured, using techniques like waterboarding And it became, something of a global outrage. A human rights organization like Amnesty International has spoken at length about this issue and advocated on behalf of those individuals who have been kept there. So it's an ongoing issue, and it's a blight well into the 21st century against, our supposed era of human rights and how universal they've become and inalienable that they've become. So this shows that it's not always the case. Another important issue that's not often talked about is slavery and modern day slavery, and this is I guess quite different to traditional forms of slavery where I basically owned you as if I owned my dog or I owned my microwave. It's not that kind of ownership anymore. More so today, slavery has to do with control over another person for economic benefit or economic gain. So we have lots of different manifestations of slavery today, from, I guess, human trafficking, so into sexual slavery, but also into domestic servitude. So, this happens in fairly wealthy countries like Hong Kong and Singapore, where they'll have arrangements with domestic workers, and often these are mutually agreed to, but there are cases which it's not exactly the case. But even in those cases where it's a mutually agreed to situation, the treatment of these domestic workers is often not ideal and sometimes quite horrific. So when I visited Singapore a few years ago, I spoke to some of these domestic workers, and they usually go there on a 2-year contract, and they live in the house of their employer. Every 2 weeks, they're allowed 1 day off, and during that day off, they're not allowed to stay in the house, so they have to go out regardless of whether or not they want to. Obviously, for the most, they want to. And depending on the situation and who the employer is, sometimes the people can be quite nasty to domestic workers. They can withhold food from them, and as is most often the case, the payment actually comes right at the end of their contract, so they're not paid as they go along, out of fear that they might run away or just break the contract and disappear. So the actual money is kept right until the end of their period of employment. So all these things are actually contrary to a number of different human rights regulations and laws. So continue to be breaches even in really wealthy countries. So to give you an idea, it's hard to quantify the number of slaves that are still in the world today, but there's estimates that roughly there are about 30 million people in the world today classified as slaves, and 10 million of those are children. So it's actually a huge and really sad state of affairs that this is still happening. Okay, so final slide. Just going to wrap up very quickly with this question, and this is the question that I guess is the key one for the week, that who has rights in world politics. It's actually a bit more complex than it sounds, because initially, if we look at a document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the answer to the question is everyone, everywhere. Human rights are inalienable. We all have them, and they can't be taken away from us. But that's actually, only one of the kind of aspirational, ideal answer that we'd like to give. But in practice, only certain people in certain times and in certain places can do anything with those rights, can exercise the rights that they have. So while everyone might have rights, not everyone can basically do anything with those rights. And a lot of it has to do with issues of ratification. So this is a legal term whereby a particular country decides not only to sign up to an international treaty or law, but to then take the next step and make that treaty into domestic law, so have it binding domestically. If a country doesn't choose to ratify, it's very hard to hold them to account. So while I might have this human right according to this or that international human rights document, if my state hasn't ratified it and made it into binding law, there's very little recourse that I have. Obviously, there are things that I can do, but these things are really extensive. They take years and years, and often by that time, the situation will have deteriorated so much. So it's a really tricky kind of double-faced issue, but I think that's what human rights is. It's a political concept, as I was saying before, and how it applies, where it applies, to what extent it applies. It all depends on politics. The other issue that's often important in relation to who has rights, everyone, everywhere, well, some countries will actually claim that, yes, human rights have become increasingly universal, but they might also contradict with the value systems present within our country. So here I'm referring to particularly the Asian values argument. So Confucianism in China, for example, that we view humans in a particular way, we view society in a particular way, and humans fit into society in this or that way. I guess it's not that we don't recognize human rights, but it doesn't necessarily apply meaningfully to our society. And if you enforce these Western values on us, it basically undermines our own culture and our own values. So that's the argument that I guess bucks the trend against this universalist argument in relation to human rights. And again, this is political, like how human rights apply in that situation would be very different to a country where culturally there is recognition that all humans are created equal and that we all have rights and so on and so forth. So we have to think about that. All right, I'm going to end this lesson now. Hope you've taken some of these points in. We're going to watch the video, the documentary now, and it's a fairly lengthy one, but there's no reading this week, so it's great. Watch the video and use that video to get you thinking about what are some of the human rights violations happening in the world today, and use that as the basis of your world news piece for this week. So I hope everyone can find something relevant. I'm sure you can. Human rights is always in the news in one form or another. Relate it to world politics and see how some of the things that were raised in the lecture or in the video can inform what you write. All right. Well, thanks again. We'll see you next week. Bye.